The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the 5 bills listed for consideration. Under Committee Rule 4, subparagraph F, any oral opening statements and hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess, subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, the member from California, Representative Panetta, the member from Washington, Representative Schreier, the member from Nevada, Representative Amude, and the member from Iowa, Representative Miller-Meeks, are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. As described in the notice today, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff as soon as possible. I'd now like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to say first, thank you all for being able to join us today virtually as the subcommittee meets to hear 5 bipartisan bills primarily focused on ways that we can quickly expand and build on recent efforts to improve landscape scale restoration, protect critical watersheds, and reduce wildfire risk. I'd be remiss if I didn't note, I know the minority ranking member, Mr. Fulcher, had noted at a prior hearing his desire to see more bills considered by this committee from the Republican side of the aisle. And so, of course, want to inform him that today, of the 5 bills we are considering, 2 are bills introduced by Republicans, 3 are introduced by Democrats, and of course, every bill is bipartisan, which is certainly a positive step in my view, and I suspect the ranking member would agree. I also would be remiss if I didn't say that our thoughts and prayers are with ranking member Fulcher in regards to the recent announcement regarding his health, and have no doubt that with the Western grit that one acquires in Idaho or Colorado or across our Rocky Mountain West, that he'll be back to full health in no time, but we're certainly thinking of him. In 2020, when my district was directly impacted by record-setting Colorado wildfires, our office started meeting with experts in Colorado to learn more about how our communities can successfully mitigate wildfire risk. At the end of April, in a wildfire oversight hearing in this subcommittee, Professor Schultz from Colorado State University testified to how collaboration, partnerships, and dedicated funding are critical to establishing shared conservation goals and yielding measurable results. To those ends, my legislation, H.R. 3211, the Joint Chief Landscape Restoration Partnership Act, would authorize the Joint Chiefs Partnership between the Chief of the U.S. Forest Service and the Chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. By authorizing $90 million annually through 2030, double the current funding level, the Joint Chiefs Partnership would help grow community support for forest and grassland landscape scale restoration projects in Colorado and around the country. I'll address H.R. 3211 in more detail later. We're very excited to have a constituent here to testify to how this program benefits Front Range communities. Next, we have legislation from my friend and colleague, Representative Panetta of California, to significantly increase resources for reforestation and recovery efforts following recent extreme wildfires. Without spending a taxpayer dollar, H.R. 2049, the Replant Act, would make an estimated $123 million, quadruple the current statutory cap, available annually through the Reforestation Trust Fund, and require a national reforestation strategy. In another example of how Congress can build on the efforts of the U.S. Forest Service and their partners, we have legislation from Representative Schreier of Washington State. H.R. 2816, the Legacy Roads and Trails Act, would build on a decade of programmatic success by authorizing road and trail maintenance funding that prioritizes watershed health and habitat connectivity while supporting recreation, saving taxpayers money, and creating local jobs. In a final case study in support of collaborative watershed-based conservation efforts, we have H.R. 3132, the Lake Tahoe Restoration Reauthorization Act, introduced by Rep. Amedee of Nevada. Since its inception in 1997, the Lake Tahoe Environmental Improvement Program has implemented 746 projects with an estimated $2.6 billion invested, and critically important to the long-term success landscape scale projects that we have at the federal government. All four of these bipartisan bills build on existing authorities to improve resilience to wildfire by investing in landscape scale restoration, watershed health, and habitat protection. Finally, the last bill on the agenda today is a reminder of what protecting our national parks, forests, and public lands is all about. The bipartisan Veterans in Parks Act, H.R. 4300, by Representative Marriott Meeks, would help prioritize access for veterans, members of the armed services, and the Gold Star families who have fought and sacrificed to defend these American treasures. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues, the administration, and other witnesses in support of these bipartisan bills. And with that, I would like to yield back and would query, Madam Clerk, if the Ranking Member Ranking Member Fulcher is with us, and if not, perhaps Ranking Member Westerman could serve as his designee.
I believe that Ranking Member Westerman is next up in the order of recognition.
Okay. Chair recognizes Ranking Member Westerman for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse, and
audio.
Can you hear me now?
Well, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Neguse, and thank you to the witnesses for participating in the hearing today. I would, like to also put a positive word in for the Veterans in Parks Act that's being included in today's hearing. It's a great piece of legislation from one of our freshman members, Representative Miller Meeks. And I'd like to applaud her for her advocacy on behalf of veterans and supporting our armed forces. Unfortunately, not all of the bills today are bipartisan bills or bills that certainly I can get along or go along with. And as I looked over one bill in particular, the Replant Act, I thought of a trick my kids played on me I think it was within the past year. They gave me these jelly beans, and they were watching intently as I was eating the jelly beans. And some of these jelly beans were mislabeled. They're not mislabeled. Some of them were very, very putrid. And as I picked through, I was enjoying them, and all of a sudden, I got one of these that was the most awful tasting thing I've ever tasted. And the message there is that although the outside looked like a jelly bean, the inside wasn't that good. And we sometimes have things that from the outside appear to be very good, but they're not that good.
And do you have the headphones?
I think that's what we've got with the Replant Act. We talk about planting trees, and that seems like a good thing, something we could all agree on. But if you look at the policy, I don't think it's going to be that good a policy. And a lot of people recognize me as a forester serving in Congress. But before I got a degree in forestry, I got one in engineering. And engineers are basically problem solvers. And I think the problem with the Replant Act is it's not solving a problem. It's simply trying to put a Band-Aid on a symptom. The problem is not necessarily that we need to replant, although that's a good thing. The problem is that we're embracing policies, and we refuse to change policies that have us burning up record numbers of acres of forest every year. Last year, we saw 10.3 million acres burn across the country. This year, we've already had 59 large fires that burned over 850,000 acres in 12 states. This just adds to our reforestation backlog.
I logged out.
When we think of replanting in these areas where we're not going to do management, we're simply just instead of calling it the Replant Act, we could call it the Refuel Act, because what we're doing is putting more trees out there that aren't going to be managed, and we're just creating a circular problem where we're going to grow these trees up. They're going to become overstocked, and we're going to see more catastrophic wildfire in the future. What we should be focusing on, along with replanting, is also doing active management on our forest. We should be focusing on how do we utilize the products that come off of our forest. I know part of the Replant Act uses money from the Canadian lumber tariffs to help fund replanting, which that doesn't sound bad, but think about why are we having to buy so much lumber from Canada that we generate tariffs that produce hundreds of millions of dollars every year? It's because we've got forests in our own country that we're not managing, that we could be creating American jobs in rural communities with, yet we'd rather sit back and watch those forests burn. This isn't sound management. It's not sound practices. And simply going out and replanting burned
You
over,
rejoined the meeting?
Well, I've rejoined the meeting.
Hold on real quick. Hold on, Mr. Westerman. If you could just pause the clock, Madam Clerk. Mr. Fulcher, we can hear you and see you. So we'll be coming to you in about 30 seconds.
On your address?
Go ahead, Mr. Westerman.
Yeah, well, I'll just wrap up and say that replanting without management, without looking at expanding markets, is a losing strategy. It's not solving the problem. It's trying to put a Band-Aid on a problem. The only ones that are going to benefit off of this that I can see are people who are making money off of government contracts to replant areas, and people who are doing
The audio icon there
which
should
we've got a multi-billion-dollar industry in firefighting already, which is a sad commentary on the management that we're doing on our forests. So, I would love to work on a bill to plant trees. I've actually got a bill that does that, but it also looks at the big picture and the total picture of how we manage and how we take care of the forest that we've got. We're not going to do anything to help the environment or the economy or rural communities simply by going
click on that has
and I believe I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. And yeah, we just wanted to give you a little extra time there because I know we had interrupted you. So, and we're all sorry about your negative experience with jelly beans. I want to now recognize Ranking Member Fulcher, if he's there. I know we had you there, Mr. Fulcher. If you want to unmute, can we hear you?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Good. It's good to see you, sir. We're all thinking of you, and Chair now recognizes you for your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My mission on the camera is to take ugly to an entire new level. So I hope that I'm succeeding to some extent, but I thank you for your patience. And in regard to the opening statement, Mr. Chairman, thank you again. Today we meet to discuss a variety of bills ranging from restoration of the Tahoe Basin to hazardous fuels reduction work conducted by the Forest Service and NRCS. While most of the bills during today's hearing deal in some manner with the Forest Service, none of the bills would actually give the Forest Service any new tools to improve forest management and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. Throughout Idaho, there are numerous fires burning, with many concentrated around the town of Lewiston. Our country is currently at a preparedness level of 4 for wildfire threats, and it's critical that any discussion about the Forest Service is focused on new authorities to get our catastrophic wildfire problem under control. In my state, I'm glad to see the Forest Service use the Good Neighbor Authority program to work with the state of Idaho to facilitate fuel reduction projects on national forest land. This type of collaboration is something that needs to be encouraged and expanded. With that being said, I'd like to highlight one bipartisan piece of legislation being considered today that reflects a type of lasting good that is achievable when we work together. This bill, the Veterans in Parks Act, is not only co-sponsored by myself and Chairman Neguse, it's also co-sponsored by Ranking Member Westerman and Chairman Grijalva. It's not every day that you can get all 4 of us to agree on a particular bill, which I think highlights just how special this piece of legislation is. While we can never fully repay the debt owed to them for their service to this country, the VIP Act is a small gesture that will ensure that no military service member, veteran, or member of the Gold Star family ever pays to access our national parks or federal lands again. This bill provides free lifetime passes to veterans and Gold Star family members to access over 2,000 recreation sites across the nation, and free annual passes for active duty military personnel. our military and veterans passes have never been codified, and this bill is an important step in ensuring these benefits are permanently protected for our American heroes. The bill, which currently has 143 bipartisan co-sponsors, is also supported by 60 organizations representing a diverse coalition of recreational, veterans, and sportsmen's interests. I'd like to commend my colleague from Iowa, Representative Miller Meeks, for her leadership on this bipartisan bill. A veteran herself, she understands the value that our federal lands hold for veterans, particularly those wounded in combat. I'm also pleased that one of her constituents, retired Army Captain John Poliska, is with us here today to testify in support of this legislation. Captain Poliska is a decorated veteran who honorably served our nation for 15 years, serving in both Iraq and Afghanistan across numerous combat deployments. Wounded in a roadside bomb attack, Captain Poliska was also awarded a Purple Heart. It is an honor to have you here today, sir. And I look forward to hearing your perspective on how time spent on federal lands aided your recovery, and also how the VIP Act can make it possible for all veterans and Gold Star families to enjoy these wonderful lands. I'd also like to congratulate you on the birth of your first son, Finn, who was born just a few days ago. Thank you to all the witnesses here today. Now you back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Ranking Member yields back. I'd like to now turn to our first panel and welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify on the bills that they have sponsored. Let me remind all of the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start. It'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use stage view or grid view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. And after your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. The chair will first recognize the gentleman from California, Representative Panetta, for 5 minutes. Mr. Panetta, you are recognized.
Hey, thank you, Chair Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher and members of the subcommittee. Greatly appreciate this opportunity, and as well as the fact that you're having this important hearing today to consider several critical pieces of bipartisan legislation, including my bill, the Repairing Existing Public Land and Adding Necessary Trees Act. As you heard, that's right, the Replant Act for short. Now, as many of you know, I grew up, I live in, and I raised my daughters and represent the Central Coast of California. Some would say that it is one of the most beautiful districts in the nation. Now, I know better than to let my bias get the best of me, especially in this forum with all of these members, but just know that you have an open invitation out to my district to make that determination for yourself. And I can tell you that if you do come to my district, what you're going to see is that my home has a lot of bounty with its rows and rows of specialty crops. And of course, it has miles and miles of natural beauty. Our coastline extends from the cliffs of Big Sur to the golf courses of Pebble Beach to the beaches in Santa Cruz. And then also we preserved inland areas from the Fort Ord National Monument to the Pinnacles National Park to the Los Padres National Forest. And unfortunately, like many of your districts, especially in the Western United States, we're also seeing, feeling, and living with the fear of wildfires. Now, last year, my district experienced 5 major fires that burned 640,000 acres, including 128,000 in the Los Padres National Forest. Then, due to a lack of post-fire tree planting and burn scar areas, we experienced a severe winter storm, which it brings about mudslides, including one that sent a piece of our scenic Highway 1 into the Pacific Ocean, a picture that many of you saw with that gaping hole in the highway with the ocean in the background. Now, it was during that same storm, we saw a number of other damaged roads, including another federal road in my district, which threatened to cut off access to critical services of the residents of Big Sur. Now, as all of us are experiencing in many of our districts, these cycles of excessive heat, extreme wildfires, and extensive mudslides are exacerbated by climate change, which means that they are not going away anytime soon. That means that we need to be prepared for hotter, drier conditions in which we no longer have wildfire seasons. That's right, we have wildfire years. Wildfires that impact our environment, our economy, but also our health and our homes and our lifestyles, and yes, unfortunately, our lives. Now, I believe it is our responsibility to deal with this pressing issue, not to just suppress fires, but to do everything we can to prevent fires. That means we must pursue every opportunity in federal funding for post-fire reforestation that will help restore and make resilient our natural landscapes and our national forests. Reforestation on our public and federal lands will not only help us better incorporate climate change into wildfire planning, it will also help us better leverage our public lands as natural climate solutions. Now, the bipartisan and bicameral Replant Act will allow the Forest Service to substantially increase its investments in post-fire reforestation. In 1980, Congress established the Reforestation Trust Fund to plant trees on National Forest System lands. The fund was financed by tariffs collected from wood products, but was capped at $30 million. Over the last 4 decades, however, the frequency and intensity of wildfires has increased, but the cap has not. That's exactly why there's a huge reforestation backlog in our federal forests. The Replant Act would remove that antiquated funding limit and direct all eligible wood product tariffs to the Reforestation Trust Fund. Such a change, as you heard, would quadruple the amount of available funding, allowing Forest Service to plant 1.2 billion trees over 4.1 million acres. These reforestation projects will not only help us make more resilient forests, it will help us prevent erosion and mudslides that I saw in my district. It will also generate 49,000 jobs over the next 10 years. On top of that, I've had extensive conversations about this bill with my good friend from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, the ranking member, as we know, of this committee, who says that if we have more forests, we need more forest management. It's exactly why we addressed that in my Wildfire Emergency Act. But look, as we work on these solutions, it's not about jelly beans. It's about wildfires. It's about our lives. And that's what's important. And as we continue to negotiate these environmental issues with management, we got to make sure that we don't let our disagreements blow up our agreements like we have here in the Replant Act. Let's make sure that this simple solution that doesn't cost anything goes forward despite our disagreements, and that we make sure that we allow ourselves to not lose sight of the reforestation of our forests because of our disagreement for the trees. Mr. Chairman, I thank you, thank the subcommittee, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta yields back. The chair now recognizes the member from Washington State, Representative Schreier, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, members of the subcommittee, for inviting me to testify on my bill, Legacy Roads and Trails. Before I get started, I just listened to my friend Jimmy Panetta, and I want to note how pleased I am to see the Replant Act considered at this hearing as well. Our forests are dying and burning in my state too at alarming rates because of climate change, and the Replant Act is a pragmatic approach that can help us address our growing reforestation backlog. So I'm proud to support that bill. Now, I recently reintroduced the Legacy Roads and Trails Act with Chairman Neguse and Representatives Mike Simpson and Derek Kilmer. And it will authorize the Legacy Roads and Trails Remediation Program through 2030 and require the Forest Service to develop a national strategy to carry out the program. Now, for those of you who don't know, Legacy Roads and Trails is a U.S. Forest Service program which leverages public and private funding to improve or decommission forest roads and trails in areas where the infrastructure is deteriorating, and as a result, threatening endangered species, impacting water quality, and resulting in threats to endangered species, and restricting access to recreation in our public lands. Now, the program was created in 2008 because the General Forest Service road maintenance budget was simply unable to address the sheer volume of blocked culverts, landslides, and washouts, which were specifically impacting water quality and reducing access to the water and to upstream habitat for threatened and endangered species. Legacy Roads is unique because it prioritizes water quality and watershed health with the goal of protecting American rivers and streams, endangered fish, and community water systems with targeted projects. Now, a few examples are repairing roads and trails used for public access, replacing failed or undersized culverts to reconnect fish habitat, and stormproofing or reclaiming roads to prevent sediment pollution from entering waterways and that are important for fish and drinking water. So Legacy Roads and Trails work is Important, it is results-oriented, it is collaborative, and funds primarily go to actual work on the ground, creating high-wage jobs for contractors, including those who specialize in stream restoration, environmental design, and heavy equipment operation. And it successfully attracts non-federal investment as well. And over half of the money used for fish passage and culvert projects actually comes from external partners, amplifying the impacts of federal funds. So with its proven track record, the Legacy Roads and Trails program enjoys broad bipartisan support and partner engagement, and few programs deliver such environmental, recreational, and economic benefits. In my district, the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest comprises 82% of Chelan County. And over the past 20 years, Chelan County has been systematically working to restore fish passage in our national forest with exactly the sorts of projects that Legacy Roads and Trails supports. And the economic benefits are also considerable. More than 3,000 jobs in Chelan and Douglas counties are supported by outdoor recreation, which is 20% of private regional employment in these counties. And this is not unique to Washington state. Now, from 2008 to 2017, the Forest Service used this program very successfully, benefiting forests, waterways, outdoor recreation while creating jobs and saving taxpayer money. But despite the considerable improvements, there has been no funding for this program since 2018. But the need for this program is great. The Forest Service has identified a backlog of over $3.5 billion in deferred maintenance for roads, nearly 400 high priority culvert projects that cost almost $110 million just for 1 year. And this program is ideally shaped to begin addressing those needs once again. So as we face an increasing threat of climate change and the need to improve our nation's crumbling infrastructure, we must ensure programs like Legacy Roads and Trails are part of the dialogue. This is a big win for our environment, our fish, and our forests. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the staff at the Natural Resources Committee for your hard work on these important bills and for inviting me to share my enthusiasm for Legacy Roads and Trails today. And I yield back whatever time I may still have.
Apologies, I was having some audio issues. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Representative Schreier, for your powerful testimony, and certainly very excited about your bill. With that, the chair will now recognize Ms. Miller Meeks from the state of Iowa for 5 minutes. Mr. Amadea is, I believe, having some health issues and so can't be with us today. So we'll go straight to Ms. Miller Meeks. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and testify today about my bill, H.R. 4300, the Veterans in Parks, or VIP Act. I was so proud to introduce this overwhelmingly bipartisan legislation with a fellow veteran and member of the Natural Resources Committee, Congressman Gallego. And I also want to thank Representative Fulcher and Representative Bruce Westerman for their support. Since the bill's introduction, we have gained support of more than 140 of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle and over 50 organizations. Our common sense legislation would give service members, veterans, and our Gold Star families free passes for life to all of our beautiful national parks and federal lands. This is a reasonable piece of legislation that will support those who sacrifice so much for our freedoms. Our nation is blessed to have some of the most beautiful parks and public lands. I know this intimately because my husband and daughter thru-hike the Appalachian Trail now twice for my husband, and also Acadia National Park. Each year, millions of Americans access the more than 2,000 federal recreation areas, including national parks, national forests, and wildlife refuges. These include some of the country's most iconic national treasures, from Acadia National Park in Maine and the Dry Tortugas in Florida to the Redwood National Forest in California and the gates of the Arctic in Alaska. In 2020, the America the Beautiful annual pass became free for veterans and Gold Star families. However, this change for veterans has never been put into law and could be undone in future years. The VIP Act protects these veterans' passes by codifying them into law and making them lifetime passes instead of annual passes that would have to be resent and reapplied for every year. Making the passes lifetime instead of annual makes the job of the Park Service easier and ensures our veterans have full access to all the benefits they deserve. Finally, the VIP Act also creates annual passes for current service members, which can be converted into lifetime passes once they retire. From sea to shining sea, we are a nation of incredible beauty and biodiversity. Congress recognizes the mental and physical benefits of outdoor recreation for our service members and veterans. As a 24-year Army veteran, I understand the sacrifices made by our military and their loved ones, and I believe we must do whatever we can to honor these VIPs. The VIP Act provides these Americans with free access to land they have sacrificed to defend. And as a doctor, I understand the healing power of nature and outdoor activity. Our national parks are here for all of us. Getting outside into nature and enjoying our beautiful country provides an outlet and escape with mental and physical benefits. No one is more worthy of experiencing open access to the incredible places that these men and women have fought to keep us free, and their families who have also made the ultimate sacrifice along with them. Unfortunately, it is often all too easy to pay lip service to military sacrifice, but then not follow through with actions to recognize that service. We can never fully repay our veterans for their service and sacrifice, but we want to show our gratitude by giving them lifetime access to America's most beautiful landscapes. Our service members, veterans, and Gold Star families should be afforded the opportunity to recover and enhance their physical, mental, and spiritual health achieved through lifetime free passes by access to our national parks. Thank you, Chair, and I yield my time.
Thank you, Ms. Miller-Meeks, for your testimony and for bringing forward this important bill. With that, the chair will now, well, I guess I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes or less than that to talk about the final bill that we'll be considering today, which is the Joint Chief Landscape Restoration Partnership Act of 2021. And I know we touched on this briefly during my opening statement, but I would certainly urge bipartisan support for my legislation that's included in today's subcommittee hearing. The bill was introduced in May of this year with Representative Spanberger and Representative Armstrong as original co-sponsors. Senator Bennett and Senator Hoeven of North Dakota have introduced companion legislation in the United States Senate. In short, the bill would authorize the Joint Chiefs Partnership between the Chief of the U.S. Forest Service and the Chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service at roughly $90 million annually, which is double the current funding level. By authorizing the program through 2030, we could enhance, support, and provide certainty for ongoing public-private landscape-scale restoration projects while improving program outreach as well as accountability. Programs like the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, or the CFLRP, and the Joint Chiefs Partnership have successfully brought diverse stakeholders together to achieve landscape-scale conservation and restoration work. While the success of the CFLRP has been recognized by Congress through programmatic authorizations and increases in annual funding, the Joint Chiefs Partnership has continued to operate without similar bipartisan recognition here in the United States Congress. Since the USDA launched Joint Chiefs in 2014, the initiative has supported 93 projects across the United States, including 2 in my state of Colorado, and treated 300,000 acres of hazardous fuels, restored 29,000 acres in priority watersheds, and enhanced 200,000 acres of wildlife habitat. Restoration projects across ownership boundaries help improve the resilience of an entire landscape. They prioritize treatment areas, and ultimately they protect communities and their water supplies, which is why I, again, would urge bipartisan support of this bill and certainly welcome co-sponsorship of the same by my colleagues. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time and thank the sponsoring members of Congress for their valuable testimony and transition us now to our second panel to hear from the administration and complete a round of member questions before transitioning to our third and final panel with questions for our non-federal witnesses. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Barney Gant, Associate Deputy Chief for the National Forest System, for 5 minutes. Mr. Gant, you are recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide the perspective of the Forest Service on the 5 public bills today. The agency's greatest challenge right now is addressing the wildfire crisis. This crisis must be addressed so we can bring long-term relief to our firefighters, our communities, and the forest. The 2020 fire year was one of the most devastating fire seasons on record, burning more than 10 million acres and resulting in the loss of too many lives. It is critical that federal, state, tribal, and local partners maintain safe roads for our fire crews, maintain our road system to accomplish more fuels treatment per year, and further invest in ecosystem restoration activities like post-fire reforestation. 4 of the bills today address these fire-related needs. First, let me speak to the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership Act will increase annual funding to $90 million through the year 2034, allowing the Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service to support projects that restore landscapes and reduce wildfire threats to communities and landowners. The agency supports this bill as it highlights the importance of cross-boundary projects and interagency partnership that work to improve the health and resilience of forest landscapes. Since 2014, the Chief of the NRCS and the Forest Service have partnered to support this initiative. One successful example was efforts to strategically place fuel reduction treatments on nearly 7,000 acres in Colorado that protected the communities of Red Feather Lakes, Rustic, and Glacier View Meadows from the Cameron Peak Fire in 2020. The next bill, the Forest Legacy Road and Trail Remediation Program. This program will ensure Forest Service road and trail networks provide safe access to the National Forest System for the public to recreate, allow for forest management activities to occur, and allow wildland firefighters and other emergency personnel reliable access in response to emergencies. The Forest Legacy Road and Trail Remediation Program will allow the Forest Service to continue maintenance to this vital infrastructure to protect or restore water quality and water function, protect drinking water systems, provide fish and wildlife habitat and watershed protection, and restore the restoration of streams and water bodies that support threatened endangered species and community water sources. The agency supports the reestablishment of this program. Next, the Replant Act. This act removes, as stated before, removes the current $30 million cap on the Reforestation Trust Fund. The Forest Service supports the Replant Act, which would close the funding gap and enable the Forest Service to address the current 4 million acre reforestation backlog that has been created by wildfires, which make up 80% of the reforestation needs on national forest lands. Next, the Lake Tahoe Restoration Act. And this act authorized $414 million for 7 fiscal years. Most of these funds supported work performed by partners to achieve forest, watershed, erosion control, and invasive plant eradication on both public and private lands. 2 examples include the Nevada Incline Fuels Reduction and Healthy Forest Restoration Project that treated the urban interface in Incline Village. And the second was a South Tahoe Fuels Treatment Project in California that provided an urban defense zone of a little over 3,800 acres. Without an increase in fuel reduction on the landscape, we will continue to face a future with large fires in California and across the West. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we support this bill and the reauthorization of the Lake Tahoe Restoration Act. And lastly, my remarks reference the importance of access to the National Forest System. The Veterans in the Park Act will provide lifetime free passes to federal lands to active duty military service members and their families, veterans and Gold Star family members. The Forest Service is committed to connecting all Americans to the great outdoors, and we welcome the opportunity to enhance and make public lands even more accessible. The agency supports the Veterans in the Park Act. Again, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Gant. We appreciate again your testimony and you being here today. The chair will now recognize Mr. Tonko for his 5 minutes of questions, and I'll remind the members this first round of questioning is specifically for our administration witness, and then we will proceed with the third panel of witnesses.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse. Am I audible?
You are, sir. We can hear you great.
Thank you so much. I am proud to represent the Capital Region of New York, where many in our community care deeply about investing in and updating our nation's broken water infrastructure. I introduced the Aqua Act to fix our nation's water infrastructure, replace local pipes and components, help communities struggling with PFAS contamination, and much more. But we also know that our natural environment plays just as great a role in ensuring that every American has clean water to drink. So, Mr. Gant, can you share more with us about how America's national forests support our nation's clean water systems, please?
Yes, I can. Roughly 20% of the water, particularly that Americans use, originate off national forests. And so you think about cities like Los Angeles, large cities in Colorado, when you look at how the national forest is situated on the landscape, and you look at where the rivers and the lakes flow, the vast majority of that water serves the American public.
Well, thank you. And given how important national forests are to America's critical water supplies, I'm alarmed at the number of streams and rivers on national forest lands that are listed as impaired under the Clean Water Act. So, Mr. Gant, what are the key factors leading to these impairment listings?
So, Congressman, legacy roads and trails are part of the system that were created on the landscape some years ago. And based on funding, many of these roads or trails are not in good condition, and they end up being sources of sediment. So one of the things that we talk about with the Forest Legacy and Roads Trails remediation program, that would provide us the opportunity to go in, either make road improvements or to maybe in some cases decommission those roads and maybe trail systems, or maybe in some cases maybe reroute just based on the location of some of the roads and trails.
And what aspects of the bills being considered today would best help us advance our commitment to deliver clean water for all Americans?
So, Congressman, the Forest Legacy Roads is one by far, with being able to manage the road systems that are currently on the system and be able to correctly either put those to bed or make improvements to those. In addition, several of the bills today that address fuel treatments will also make a significant impact. If we're able to go and be able to reduce those fuels, be able to stabilize the soils, that will also make a big improvement with being able to maintain the water quality in our aquatic systems.
Mm-hmm. The current reforestation backlog of more than 1.3 million acres, I'm told, in our national forest lands also poses a grave concern for our nation's water supplies. And these harms will only grow, I would believe, with the worsening effects of climate change that we are already seeing, including a higher risk of wildfire, droughts, disease, and so on. So, Mr. Gant, how does climate change impact the need for reforestation?
So that's a really good question, Congressman. So what we've experienced, particularly over the last decade, is the wildfires that occur on the landscape are more and more severe. And with that severity, with the removal of nearly all the vegetation, now that means that your soils are susceptible to erosion, particularly high storms and actually snow melt and runoff. How the reforestation or the Replant Act will help enhance moving forward with the carbon storage is if we as an agency are going to move ahead with sequestering carbon, trees will most certainly need to be a vital part of that with storage. So not only, with being able to try to help stabilize the soils, but also replanting our forests, particularly forests in the future, are also going to be very significant with carbon storage with our goals as well.
Well, it seems to me that we need to get back to a more sustainable footing as it relates to these protection and prevention efforts. So I look forward to working with the agency so as to be certain that we can address the reforestation issues. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Fulcher for 5 minutes.
And just to clarify, Mr. Chairman, this is questions for Mr. Gant, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Mr. Gant, thank you for participating today and for your testimony. I have a couple things I would like to ask you, if I may. As you know, the Western states, Idaho is a state that I represent and is included in that. The Western states have a tremendous problem with wildfire. This year, we've already had more than 800,000 acres that have gone up in smoke, and we may surpass the 10.3 million that was burned last year. And so my question is in regard to this. Can you provide a status update on where things stand, and any steps that are being taken to increase the pace and scale that would prevent wildfire and mitigation? I'll even go so far as to share my bias. I believe there needs to be a more active and wise management, but nevertheless, could you provide us a status update in terms of where the agency is to increase pace and scale to prevent and mitigate?
Yes, thanks, Congressman. So the agency has worked diligently over the last several years with expanding our relationships with states, with collaboratives, and working with environmental groups, and coming together and looking at how do we share resources. In addition, even with our work with the National Resource Conservation Service with the Two Chiefs project. So those are a few things that we're doing with being able to look across the landscape and sharing resources. And another thing that we do as an agency is really taking advantage of some tools that Congress has given us in relation to category exclusions, which ultimately help reduce the amount of time that's taken to get projects done. And so those tools help us to do the right work in the right place, the right time, to be able to try to get ahead of these issues with the fuels problems that exist on the landscape.
Thank you.
And Congress, I would like to add, Congressman Westerman made a point about market. There is a lack of infrastructure for the agency to be able to move low value material as a part of that.
And Mr. Gant, as a follow-up to that, thank you for that information. As a follow-up to that, talk to me about where you stand with your ability to get the labor that you need, your firefighting crews. Are you able to get the workers, the laborers you need?
So currently, right now, Congressman, for us as an agency, we work year-round with being able to hire the firefighters that we need in order to help with the suppression efforts. And in addition to that, we've got agreements and arrangements with counties and other agencies in the states as well, to be able to deploy and share resources across the country.
Okay, so you are able to get the labor you need.
Yes, sir. And then in addition, Congressman, we have almost weekly reports. Fire is not actually in my resource area, but I do know that fire and aviation staff work along with the chief's office looking at fire activity across the agency and making assessments on where to send the right resources in order to be able to help with suppression of fires across the agency.
Okay, you'll be a good contact, but as I think my local authorities might beg to differ on that response. So I'll probably be getting back to you on that. I'm going to shift gears just for a little bit before my time is out. I am a sponsor of the Trillium Trees Act that Mr. Westerman is the leader on. And I believe that personally it has a more comprehensive approach than what we're discussing today, or one of the things we're discussing today, which is the Replant Act. One of the shortcomings of the Replant Act is I don't think that really addresses some of those labor shortages. And so this is one of those sales pitches here that I introduced the Forestry Education and Workforce Development Act that did get inserted to Trillium Trees. And I just want to make that statement, make sure that you're aware of that. And I do believe that you might be mistaken on just some of the ability to staff some of these labor shortages. Shifting gears once again, Mr. Gann, I mentioned in my opening statement, I believe that any discussion about forest management is incomplete unless we also focus on new authorities and streamlining to expedite critical forest management projects. We're dealing with some large scale disasters, and small solutions won't cut it. And that being said, HR 3211 authorizes the existing Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership, which by all accounts has been a helpful tool. Do you see merit with that bill? Do you believe that that's necessary, given you've already been implementing the program for 7 years, I believe?
Congressman, yes, I do. So the work that the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Forest Service has been conducting is not in law by in any.
Mr. Gant, you seem to have muted yourself there.
And Mr. Chairman, I think I ran out of time as well. So
yeah, that's okay.
I feel back.
Well, Mr. Gant, you can proceed with your answer.
Congressman, yes, I think it does add value. So as the work that we're doing with the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Forest Service, we're not the only two that are working. We're working across the landscape with state organizations, different collaboratives, and nonprofits as we look at trying to do work. I think as far as investment goes, our different entities, knowing that they have a firm and committed financial resource in order to do that work, is really beneficial. So as other entities are looking at making investments, I think it's imperative in a partnership that we make those same investments as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Ms. Ledger Fernandez is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Neguse, and thank you, Associate Deputy Chief Gant, for your testimony, and Representative Shire for her bill. So New Mexico is home to 6 national forests, which contribute $1.2 billion and over 33,000 jobs that our state's outdoor recreation economy generates. So, you know, it's so key. Our national forests are so key to us here. But we also know that climate change and wildfire increasingly threaten our beautiful forests. And recent reporting has shown that Latinos are more than twice as likely to live in areas severely impacted by wildfires than other Americans. So many individuals in my district, I mean, I remember cutting wood as a child and as an adult to heat the home with firewood. And we use Forest Service roads to access that firewood collection areas. One of our problems is that counties often have to take on the burden of maintaining Forest Service roads at significant cost, or they deal with the consequences of their deterioration. Mr. Gant, could you describe how the Legacy Roads and Trails Act would help support these communities, access to firewood and other important resources?
Yes, thanks, Congresswoman. So the Forest Service has a little over 370,000 miles of roads, and roughly 159,000 miles of trails. So with the Forest Legacy and Roads, what that will help us do is continue to enhance the work that we've already have done. So with the previous funding of the $300 million that the Forest Service received, we have rehabilitated 546 miles of roads, and we improved access to nearly 1,000 national recreation areas, replaced 29 bridges in poor conditions, and then other aquatic organism passage. So to answer your question more specifically, Congresswoman, you know, with being able to do the work in relation to our road system, it's going to be able to provide access for emergency work. And it also serves as a way to help improve the roads that serve as major arteries for a lot of counties and states that cover and transverse the national forest. So not only is it for access for the national forest, but the road system that's a part of the national forest, particularly as you look at how the forest is a large land base in many counties, being able to travel across those roads in a safe way to get people back and forth to work, emergencies, and then other maintenance is really critical.
Right. You know, I would point out that public lands alone in New Mexico, we'd be the 10th largest state. So yes, those roads are really important as we connect our communities. Another issue that I wanted to highlight that my district experiences, and I think everybody who has forest experience, is illegal motorized access to sensitive areas of forest, which can elevate the risk of wildfire ignition. We've had those instances, and can impact riparian areas. Some communities have identified areas for decommissioning roads. You know, on the other hand, we want to maintain the ones that are most important, but it's also important to decommission those that the forest and those who depend on those forests would benefit. Can you describe how the Legacy Roads and Trails Acts would provide that flexibility to decommission roads, and then how communities can make sure they're involved in the process, in the decommissioning process, and are aware of what's happening?
So Congresswoman, roads are extremely important to everyone. And so as we look at the Legacy Road program, you know, the forest and the different units, whether they're at a district level or a forest level, are going to be working with the various partners and really thinking and having conversations about the road systems and how they connect and how important they are. And then also at the same time, really thinking about, are there some roads that are degrading the aquatic system, or they're causing aquatic organism passage? And as I mentioned before, the Forest Service is really strong in working with collaboratives. And so I think that's going to be another opportunity for us as an agency to continue to work with counties, other local officials, different user groups, with really looking at the road system and the right roads in the right place, you know, really thinking about the land base and the objectives on public land.
Thank you so very much. I was in the forest this weekend meeting with Forest Services. We have great ones. I would challenge the idea of who has the most beautiful district. I think the 3rd Congressional District is up there, but I think we all are that's the beautiful part of, we want to protect these beautiful places we call home. Everyone on this committee, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields back. For the benefit of the committee, U.S. News and Report just issued their best rankings on best places to live in the United States of America, and Boulder, Colorado, in the 2nd Congressional District, was ranked #1. So I think we have a barometer by which we can measure that particular question. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Westerman, if he is still with us. I believe there's a city in Arkansas that was #2 or 3, so kudos to him. Mr. Westerman, are you with us? Well, we can see you, but can't hear you. All right, we're still having a little bit of trouble hearing you, Mr. Westerman. How about, there are only a few people who are asking questions, so why don't we recognize Mr. Tiffany, and then we'll come back to you next, Mr. Westerman. Mr. Tiffany? We'll give him a few seconds, and if not, we'll go to Mr. Rosendale, who I know is with us.
Yes, I am.
All right. We can hear you great. You're recognized.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. Right now, our forests across the West are being ravaged by destructive wildfires. As a matter of fact, as I look at my door right here, our visibility has been reduced to just a fraction of a mile because of the smoke that's going through the state of Montana as we speak. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, 59 large fires are burning well over 860,000 acres in 12 states. The reason for that is quite clear: mismanagement, allowing forests to become overgrown, and both surface and ladder fuels to build up to dangerous levels lead to many of out of control fires that we're seeing today. Mr. Gant, I've got a couple of specific questions for you that I hope that you have the data for. How many proposed timber sales are currently tied up in litigation?
Congressman, I do not have the answer to that question. I'll need to get with our staff and get that answer back to you.
Thank you so much. I would like that as soon as possible because it's going to play a major part in all of the discussions that we have forward for all of this legislation. While you're checking that, if you could also find out how many acres does that cover of these timber sales that are tied up in litigation, how many total acres of forest does that cover?
Okay. So Congressman, as I understand your question, is how many timber sales do we have that are in litigation, and what's the acre figures associated with those timber sales?
Yes, sir. And I've got one more question to tie into that. It's what is the total value of those sales? I know when I was serving on the land board for the state of Montana, and we were responsible for managing 5.2 million acres of school trust lands here within the state. When we let those timber sales out, we had a minimal bid amount. And so I'm estimating that you probably have the same thing. So if we can get also what's the total value, the minimal, at least the minimal value of those of that total number of sales. So we get the value, the acreage, and the number of those sales that are tied up in litigation right now.
Congressman, we'll be able to get that information to you as quickly as we can.
Perfect, perfect. So as we go forward, my question's about the Replant Act, which would enact vast reforestation efforts, while I believe is well-intentioned. Widespread reforestation efforts without a responsible strategy to manage our forests to mitigate the risk of catastrophic wildfires would make the problem worse. So my question in regards to the Replant Act, Mr. Gant, with the current challenges facing the National Forest Service system, how can we be certain that the forested areas can be managed effectively when the Forest Service is having trouble managing forests that we currently have?
So Congressman, that's a really good question. So as we look at the Replant Act, the agency is looking at how do we try to restore the forests that are burned as a part of the severe wildfires. I think, the work that we've done and several of the bills that are introduced today are looking at how do we work together with other agencies, how do we prioritize where we get work done, and then really thinking about the resources that are available to us to be able to continue to do the work. So when you look at over 193 million acres across the landscape, Congressman, there is a lot of work, and we are trying to use the resources as effectively as we possibly can, looking at different partners, non-traditional partners, with ways and resources to be able to address the fuels issues. So we're not trying to take away that the acknowledgement that we know there's a really big fuels problem and it's causing a lot of devastation across the landscape. We're going to continue to work to the best of our ability to streamline NEPA and do the right place and the right work and try to impact communities in a positive way with coming at our fuels problem. And as I mentioned before, another thing that we'll need to do is look at how do we develop and move the low value material that exists on the national forest as well.
So as a follow-up to that, and I appreciate that, I find it troubling that the Biden administration, in addition to wanting to reforest without a management strategy, is pushing the so-called 30 by 30 initiative to lock up even more of our federal lands from proper management and timber harvesting. How do you believe the Biden administration's 30 by 30 initiative, which aims to restrict critically necessary management activities like timber harvesting, will have on worsening the wildfire crisis?
So the gentleman's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Congressman, in preparation for the testimony today, I really focused on the Replant Act and not really considering about what that means in relation to the overall 30 by 30. The Replant Act primarily focuses on reforesting the landscape that's been burnt as a result of the fires. And so regardless of what future activities may occur, right now, as far as the agency, we have a backlog of nearly 4 million acres that needs to be replanted as a result of the wildfires. And if we want forests in the future, we're going to need to be proactive about that with replanting, because many of those areas do not currently have a seed source because the trees and seed sources have been burnt as a result of the fires.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chair, thank you for the additional time. I would yield back, and I'll look forward to getting that extra information, Mr. Gann.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Oh, technical difficulties. Another argument for in-person hearings. But Mr. Gann, thank you for your testimony today. What is the main driver of the reforestation backlog?
Good question, Congressman. Right now, roughly 80% of the reforestation needs on the national forest exist as a result of wildfires.
Okay. Are there any provisions in HR 2049 that would help the Forest Service prevent future wildfires?
You know, Congressman, I don't know. I'll have to check and get back to you, Congressman.
Yeah, well, I'll answer that. I don't think there is. Which, if we had provisions like that, it would make the bill much better. Mr. Gann, I know you're deputy chief now. Congratulations on that. You've also served as deputy regional forester, so I know you understand forestry practices. When we see a catastrophic wildfire where you have a need to go in and replant, if we were doing a forestry practice to mimic that, what would that be? It'd be a clear cut. Catastrophic wildfire is mimicked by a clear cut, a stand replacing activity. So essentially, we're clear cutting millions of acres of national forest every year through catastrophic wildfire. If you don't clear cut, then you've got standing trees there that can reseed and you can get your regeneration without having to plant. So I just want us to all realize that the situation that we're talking about where there's need to go in and replant is because we've allowed catastrophic wildfire to clear cut our national forest, which I know most people are very opposed to clear cutting on the national forest. Mr. Gann, do you believe that the Forest Service will ever be able to fully tackle the reforestation backlog if we continue burning up millions of acres every year? Is there any way to get ahead of this if we're simply just replanting where we've clear cut with catastrophic wildfire?
So Congressman, let me maybe address the Replant Act first, and then I'll get to the other part of your question. So right now, based on the backlog that we have, we feel that with additional resources, we'll be able to correct and be able to replant the backlog of the acres that we have. As far as our work in the future, I think, we'll continue to need to work with doing the right work in the right place and be able to get ahead of our fuels problem. And I do believe, as I mentioned before, that much of the work that we're currently doing with sharing resources and working across boundaries and landscapes, I think will make a vital difference with being able to do the work that we actually need to do. And then continue to make investment with fuel reductions. And if we're able to do that, which is an emphasis with the new administration, I don't know that we'll totally alleviate the need for reforestation, but I think it will be greatly reduced over time.
And as we look down the road on replanting, we know that if we're going to replant, we have to plant close enough that the desirable species shade out the weeds, if you will, the undesirable species. And if we don't do that, then we create more fuel hazard, and we could end up burning up the trees that we've replanted. So if you plant closely to create this closed canopy, at some point you've got to go in and thin that out. So if we don't have any kind of management plan in place, it appears to me that just planting trees for the sake of replanting trees, we're just going to create additional wildfires going forward. It'd make much more sense from an investment standpoint if we actually planted trees with a management plan in place that could be implemented. Deputy Chief, I know the current chief, soon to be former chief, Ms. Christensen, has indicated that we need to be doing about 4 times the amount of management on federal lands. But also, I know that we've got some places that are pretty well managed in our urban areas where we could be replanting a lot of trees. And in the Trillium Trees Act, we actually had a subtitle to include $15 million in increased appropriations for urban and community forestry programs, whereas the replant program would have, or bill would have, nothing for urban forest. Can you talk about the importance of urban forestry and how we can fight climate change and create more green spaces with the urban forestry program?
So Congressman, the state and private program is not actually in the area that I oversee as Associate Deputy Chief. But I do know that our state and private forestry staffs do work with state foresters and other entities in the urban environment. Congressman, just out of fairness, I think I'll have to get back to you after coordination with the proper staff with being able to respond to your question, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Gant. We've got a lot of opportunities where we can plant trees and make a difference, and I appreciate your work, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize Mr. Tiffany if he has any questions for the administration witness. And again, just to clarify, this round of questioning, which will be concluding shortly, is just for Mr. Gant, and then we'll proceed with our witnesses.
Yeah, I'll pass for now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany. The chair would recognize Mr. Moore if he is here, which I don't believe he is.
I'm here.
Is he? Okay, Mr. Moore,
yes,
you
sir.
are. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Neguse. Thank you all, Mr. Guyan, for being here. A couple questions we're going to go along some similar lines. 30 years ago, the Forest Service reported that 10.5 billion board feet of timber were harvested each year. Despite increases in timber sales under the Trump administration, we only harvested 2.5 billion board feet of timber in 2020. Can you give some perspective on that, some context, speak to why the harvest numbers have declined so much?
So Congressman, I apologize, but you came in kind of broken up. Could you repeat the question for me?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay right now.
Much better now, thank you.
My apologies. When you compare 30 years ago, when there was 10.5 billion board feet that were harvested of timber, compared to 2020 when we had 2.5 billion. Just if you would provide some context as to why harvest numbers have declined so much.
So Congressman, I think that's a pretty detailed answer. I think one is, I think there's been I think demand is one. And then another one is what Congress asked us to deliver on the national forest as far as the board feet each year that it is expected for the agency to produce. And then when we get our request on what our target should be, I'm gonna call it targets, is then we work really hard with our staff to make sure that we are doing the right work in the right place. We're making sure that we are following all the different laws related to the Endangered Species Act or Heritage Acts, Clean Water Act, and doing our current analysis to be able to put those timber sales up to be sold. And another part is that in not all cases will the timber that we put up, will it sell? In some cases, we have no bid timber sales as regard to maybe due to market conditions, things along that nature. So it's not, Congressman Moore, it's not necessarily just a really clear-cut answer, but it's very complex. But those are just a few things that we take in consideration with being able to produce the timber volume sold on national forests.
Thanks. Yeah, it never seems to be a clear-cut answer. I do understand that. You've actually touched on some of the next question that I had with respect to what tools does the Forest Service have or need to harvest timber more efficiently. You touched on that a little bit. I'll go ahead and just yield back my time, Chairman, if it's okay, to Ranking Member Westerman.
The gentleman yields balance of his time to Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Moore. Mr. Gann, earlier you were talking about markets. If the Forest Service didn't have holdups on being able to manage, are there markets out there for the trees? Is there the infrastructure for small diameter trees, for large diameter trees? Is there any way to use the material that's on Forest Service land right now?
So right now, Congressman, I think there's some initial discussions, and I think there are starting to be different kind of trials in place to look at low value material. For instance, pellets is one, cross laminated timber is another good example where people are looking at what are different ways to use low value wood products that serve, to help create jobs. It also helps with carbon storage, and it's also a way to help remove the low value material off the national forest.
Yeah, Mr. Gann, as you're probably aware, wood products prices have reached all-time highs. And in my home state, where we have, we've got a couple million acres of national forest there on the Ouachita and the Ozark that actually has a little bit of management done on it. But investors are building mills. They're building facilities to use low-value material as well as sawlog material at record rates. It's 3 years out on delivery because the supply is available. And in my home state, last year there were a growth of 44 million tons of wood on private and public lands. There was a harvest of 24 million tons. So the state increased production by 20 million tons while supporting a vibrant forest products industry. I don't see anybody that's serious about investing looking at federal lands, which gets back to your point of needing markets for low value materials.
Mr. Ranking Member, I hate to interrupt. Time has expired there.
I missed the clock there. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Tiffany. Is it possible for me to jump in when it's good for you?
Yes. Well, so next on the gentleman's time has expired. The chair will recognize Ms. Harrell, and then Mr. Tiffany, if you'd like to go after that, we're certainly welcome to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Gant, for being here. And I can tell by this conversation, there's a lot of good things that we're sharing. And I think my biggest concern with HR 249 is I'm not sure that the bill does enough and has the provisions for active forest management to ensure that new trees planted under the bill are not lost to catastrophic fire. And I think we've heard that a couple of times. I also believe the bill does not contain necessary provisions to ensure markets for timber. And I think Chairman or Ranking Member Westerman just touched on that. And of course, this is crucial for the economies of forest communities and long-term forest health. But the one thing I do want to talk about is this low value fuel. I actually introduced the Biochar Act, which would incentivize the use of low value timber to make a biochar, a substance that has been proven to be beneficial when used in agriculture and other functions. My question, Mr. Gann, is do you see biochar as an important tool to finding a market for low value timber in our forests? And as you know, the so-called low value timber is often the strongest fuel in the creation of catastrophic fires. So how important do you think biochar could actually be in this instance?
So good question, Congresswoman. So our research branch of the Forest Service has been conducting some work in relation to biochar. And so there's specifics related to that and how effective that is. I'll need to coordinate with our research branch. But generally speaking, I do believe that currently we will, as a system, and all of us really need to take a look at, well, what are all the different opportunities that exist in front of us to be able to get ahead of this issue. But but the specifics in biochar, I'll have to defer to our research branch of the agency with the different tests that they've done in different locations and how effective the use of biochar has been with either storing carbon or providing nutrients to the soil.
Thank you, Mr. Gant. And I'd be more than happy to be involved in that conversation as it moves forward with your department, because I just think this is a great opportunity for us to really utilize this low value fuel. And then one other question I have in terms of this bill in my district, and of course across the West, we're in severe drought conditions. Could you put on the record for the committee some of the detrimental impacts of replanting trees in areas of severe drought without proper active management procedures in place? What are your thoughts on that?
So as we look at a charred landscape, Congresswoman, we actually look at soil conditions, which tree species are probably most suited. In a lot of cases, those will be replacement of species. And then we try to plant those trees in a time, primarily mostly in the winter, where we think the trees will have the greatest chance for success with being able to survive. And so those are some considerations that we look at. We have our foresters and our silviculturists, with looking at writing prescriptions on what trees to plant, where. The stocking density is one of the things that Congressman Westerman laid out earlier as well. And because, if you think about it, so planting trees is an investment. And so you want that investment to be successful. And so those are the things that we consider as we look at with planting the trees. And then also, once the trees get a certain age, there are prescriptions that we have where it might be some post-commercial harvest standing in those stands in order to help reduce competition for sunlight and resources. And at the same time, reducing the stocking density of those areas, Congresswoman, in addition to help reduce the impacts of wildfires if and when they occur.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Tiffany for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me a few minutes. Mr. Gant, has the Forest Service looked at expanding the Good Neighbor Authority, which seems to have had some real success, as Ranking Member Fulcher talked about?
So, Congressman, I am unfamiliar. I think the latest with the Good Neighbor was some extensions in 2018. I'll need to check. I think there was some questions on how do we maybe expand that to work with counties and tribes with Good Neighbor. But I'll need to get back to you with that on the specifics, Congressman.
Yeah, I would really appreciate that. I can tell you in my state of Wisconsin, we've seen some real success after the Good Neighbor Authority was authorized in 2014. And we've nearly tripled the amount of wood that is coming over to Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest here in the ensuing years, which has been a real success. We were at all-time lows about a decade ago, and people came together, sportsmen, people that are involved with industry, as well as environmental concerns like the golden winged warbler being threatened as a result of not having early successional species. People from all walks of life came together up here, and we held here state talking. Management on our national forest was not working, and the Good Neighbor Authority has been successful. And I think we need to find things like that that allow local people to by them taking the lead. I think we've seen some real success. But I would just say our natural forests of preservation versus management. With that, what started in, a lot of people cite the year as 1988, when we really began the whole ethos of preservation versus management, went into full tilt in 1993 in the first year of the Clinton administration, when they decided they're going to shut down our national forests. And that largely happened over the years. I did authorized funding for a study here in the state of Wisconsin, which we were able to extrapolate, and this study has been peer reviewed. If anyone wants to see it, they're sure welcome to, where we estimate the cost here in Wisconsin to the federal government has been about $250 million of lost value on just the Chequamegon-Nicolet, 1.5 million acres. We've lost that much value, and that does not include the downstream loss of producing end products like those 2x4s that are in such shortage. And the amazing thing to me is that the Chequamegon-Nicolet is recognized as one of the better managed national forests here in America. I can only imagine a national forest that's managed worse than what we see here in the Chequamegon-Nicolet, because we have about half of it that is shut off from being able to be utilized or having proper management rather than this preservation ethos. And I would just say this to my friends on the other side of the aisle: until you take on the radical environmentalists, you're going to continue to see smoke year after year and tens of thousands of acres of smoke, because we are even seeing that smoke right here in Wisconsin. 2 days ago, we saw it here in the upper Midwest. Though we're in a period of time where it's been somewhat dry in a few places, but largely we've had good rainfall. We are seeing the western smoke year after year, and it has really hit us once again as a result of the wildfires that are out there. And if we want to look at good management practices, what we should do is turn back the clock and look at when we had good management, and that was pre-1988. And I think if we would do that, let's go back and look at how local people created solutions when management was the ethos on our national forests rather than this preservation mentality. When we get back to that point, we will see a significant decrease in those wildfires that are going on across the western United States. Until we get back to the management ethos, and you're hearing it from my colleagues. Representative Harold just mentioned it. Representative Westerman talks about it consistently. Until we get back to that, we are going to continue to see these wildfires across the West and across our country that are polluting our air as a result of a lack of management. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for giving me the time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Obernolte if he has any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was enjoying the line of questioning between Congressman Westerman and Mr. Gant, so I'd like to yield my time to the ranking member of the full committee so that can continue.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Obernolte, for yielding. And Mr. Gant, I was talking about the infrastructure we need to properly manage the forest, and Congress has tried to give the Forest Service tools. The Good Neighbor Authority has been talked about quite extensively, which is a program that actually works where it's implemented. But we also, in 2018, gave you a tool in the Farm Bill for a 20-year stewardship contract. And I know there was work being done on the Fry area, and that was put out as a 20-year stewardship contract, but no contract has been awarded yet. So we just saw this huge boon in demand for wood products, a high supply pricing, investors wanting to build. You've obviously got people who are bidding on the Fry contract who could have already had their projects built to utilize small diameter material to create good economies there in those rural areas, and also to prevent wildfire so that we could replant the old-fashioned way, letting the seeds regenerate from the trees. Can you tell why programs like the stewardship contracting are so slow to get off the ground, and maybe why there hasn't been a contract awarded on Fry yet?
So Congress, I can't speak specifically on the status on why a contract hasn't been awarded on Fry just yet. As I understand it, the region and the forest was in the process of doing evaluations on the bids that came in for that contract. So I'll have to defer and get back to you on the specifics on why a contract hasn't been let on Fry as of yet. And as far as the use of the 20-year stewardship, Congressman, I don't have a good reason why we haven't moved forward with more of those in the agency. And so I'll need to check with our various staffs and get back to you with an answer on that, Congressman.
Appreciate that. And do you see why an investor that had the money to build a facility, say at Fry, would be tempted just to go somewhere else where they could have, if they've been bidding on this since 2018 or 2019, they could have probably built the facility twice in an area where they had a reliable resource. So what do you estimate the cost of replanting the 4 million acres would be?
Congressman, let me get back to you with the specifics on that, because I think a part of it would be the location, the site prep needed. And I'm unable to give you an answer today with that, Congressman. If you allow me an opportunity to work with the staff on just kind of getting an average of the site prep that's actually needed, locations, and what normally the contracts usually cost for planning contracts, I'll be able to get you more precise numbers on that, Congressman.
And I think, we're looking at removing a $30 million yearly cap. It seems like I saw somewhere $170 million per year to plant, which, putting that much more money into planting without the infrastructure and the nurseries could be a problem. And I say the infrastructure and, labor and the nurseries. But last year the Forest Service spent, or the federal government, the taxpayers spent $2.27 billion to fight fires. If we're talking about another $150 million a year, we're looking at a huge industry there just in fighting fires and then replanting the clear cuts that the fires make. So do you think it would be a wiser use of tax dollars to actually go in and do management that would prevent the fires? Even that be more pragmatic than just replanting after the fires?
So Congressman, I think we've got to do both. If we want forest in the future, particularly as a result of the wildfires, and as I mentioned a little earlier, those fires being severe, there are in some situations, as you know, as a forester, there's no sea source. And so if we want forest back in those really severely burnt areas, we're going to need to be deliberate about being able to do that. So I think there is an opportunity to move forward with the Replant Act to be able to reestablish forests on national forests, and also think there's an opportunity for us to try to continue to make investments for fuels work in the future as well.
Thank you, Mr. Gant. My time has expired again, Mr. Chairman.
No, Duncan's time has expired. The chair will recognize, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes since I haven't asked any questions of Mr. Gant. And I guess I wanted to say a couple of things. First and foremost, Mr. Gant, thank you for being here and for your testimony today. And I appreciate your dexterity and your agile response to questions that many of which are focused on the 5 bills that are before this committee, some of which are beyond the ambit of those 5 bills and certainly beyond the ambit of your responsibilities within the Forest Service. And so I appreciate your flexibility, sir, and certainly will welcome your written answers to any of the follow-up questions that folks have posed. I guess I just wanted, to kind of clear the air a bit, because while I certainly have appreciated the robust exchange of views around forest management, I hope we don't lose sight of the fact that, as Mr. Gant said, it's important for us to do both. And these 5 bills that are before the committee, or rather the 4 bills that are primarily focused on forests and forest management practices, in fact, do both. The Joint Chiefs Program, which is a bipartisan bill that we are considering today, that myself and Kelly Armstrong of North Dakota have introduced, essentially provides for the type of forest management projects that Mr. Westerman, Mr. Rosendale, Mr. Tiffany have all implored this committee to consider. And without perhaps boring the committee, I would simply point you to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's website that lists out the 93 projects that have been funded as part of the Joint Chiefs Program. Many of those programs are fuel reduction projects in Idaho, in Arkansas, in Alabama, in Florida, in Colorado. I'll list one off just for context. I think it's helpful. One of the projects that's been funded for 2021 is a project in Idaho called the North Fork Hazardous Fuels Reduction Project. It's in Lemhi County, Salmon Chalice National Forest, and the purpose of the project is to implement fuel reduction treatments in areas threatened by the invasion and continued buildup of cheatgrass on federal and private land. Sources and causes of this buildup include disturbance in wildfire, mining, timber harvest, heavy use by big game, and grazing. Treatments will include ground-based and or aerial applications, reseedings, as well as understory thinning on private land to provide fuel breaks where applicable. And I think that's an important distinction, that this particular program, much like some of the programs that have been referenced, involves engagement of private landowners, stakeholders at the community level, working with the Forest Service hand in hand to try to develop forest management practices that work for that particular area. So I just want to remind everyone why we're here, because it sounds like many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want us to pursue more forest management practices, and I would hope that they would take yes for an answer when it comes at least to the Joint Chiefs bill. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time, and the chair will recognize, I believe we have one final, Ms. Miller-Meeks on the Republican side, and then Ms. Porter on the Democratic side. Ms. Miller-Meeks, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chair Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher. It's an honor to introduce to you my constituent, Captain John Poliska, to testify on the Veterans
Ms. Miller, let me clarify. I'm sorry, because we kind of went out of order. So this is just final witnesses, final questions from Mr. Gantz, and then we'll move to the witness panel. So if you have no questions, we'll move to that.
I have no questions.
Okay, Gentlewoman.
Thank you for offering the opportunity.
Of course. The chair recognizes Ms. Porter if she is here, and if not, we will proceed with hearing directly from our witnesses. And with that, we will do so. So again, I want to say thank you for your valuable testimony, Mr. Gant. I will remind the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. And so the chair will now recognize the next round of witnesses. And let me just make here. As with the first two panels, so Mr. Gant, again, thank you for being here, and we'll certainly look forward to seeing you in front of the committee again. As with the first two panels, the oral statements that are made will be limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start. It'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. Let me just see here. The chair will now start by recognizing Mr. Jad Daly, President and CEO of American Forests, for his testimony on HR 2049. And again, I want to say thank you to all of the witnesses, including Mr. Daly, for their patience. We welcome your testimony. You're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair Neguse and ranking members Westerman and Fulcher and members of the subcommittee for this opportunity to speak with you about the urgent need to accelerate reforestation of our national forests with the bipartisan Replant Act. And I think really importantly to the great discussion that you all were just having, using world-leading climate-informed, climate-resilient reforestation techniques that are being developed by the U.S. Forest Service with its partners. I would also like to thank Congressman Jimmy Panetta of California and Congressman Mike Simpson of Idaho for their tremendous leadership on this important legislation. So the Replant Act is an issue of great importance to American forests, given our long history with the U.S. Forest Service and our national forests, having helped to establish both through our organizing and advocacy in the early 1900s. You know, for more than 100 years, we worked to understand the pressures on our national forests and the actions we must take to sustain them into the future. And we've heard it from others today our national forests are being overwhelmed by the effects of climate change. And when we leave them unrepaired after events like intensive wildfire, we're turning national forests into national burn scars, turning them from a national asset into a community hazard. So burned over moonscapes and damaged lands are not what America needs from our national forests, which represent the single largest forest ownership in our nation. Our national forests work best when they have trees. And so that's why in this moment of climate crisis, with our forests being overwhelmed by wildfire, pests, and more, the Replant Act is one of the most strategic, impactful, and ready investments that we can make in America's forests. And better yet, this solution is simple. We've heard that today. When Congress wisely established the Reforestation Trust Fund in 1980, a time, by the way, when many of us were in grade school and a carton of eggs cost 84 cents, it included a $30 million cap. That was enough to do the job in 1980. It isn't close to enough anymore. And we have a simple way to fix it by removing this outdated 40-year-old cap on the Reforestation Trust Fund. My written testimony contains much more detail about this urgent investment in our public lands, which I look forward to exploring via your questions. So I want to use the remaining time just to anchor the discussion in 4 key numbers around the Replant Act. My first number is 100%. That is the climate change driven increase, a doubling of the acreage burned by Western wildfire between 1984 and 2015, as found by leading research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And that was created by a drying of our forests and increased aridity of fuels driven by climate change. And that's what's feeding our wildfire crisis. Well, now we're seeing in the last couple of years, we've now really crossed a tipping point, and our wildfire crisis is suddenly getting much worse. Just consider that this year already, we've set a record for the number of recorded fires by June. And by the way, that's part of a much larger climate crisis in our forests, a forest health crisis driven by climate change in our forests. It takes many different forms around the country, well beyond wildfire, things like windstorms and increased pest infestations. All of those things are driving a need for greater reforestation. So my second number is 4 million. And we've heard this one today. That's the number of acres the Forest Service now estimates has in its backlog of reforestation needs, actually a greatly increased number from what it had previously projected. And because the funds from the Reforestation Trust Fund have been limited by this $30 million cap, that's not even enough money to keep up with the new acres that need to be reforested each year, let alone chip away at this 4 million acre backlog that just grows more and more quickly every single year. In fact, our Western wildfires in 2020 added 1 million acres alone to this backlog. And that really just violates our proud, longstanding tradition of taking care of our public lands so they can serve us best. My third number is 15%. That's the amount of America's carbon emissions that are sequestered by our forests and forest products every single year. And the science tells us that reforestation could increase that by nearly half. Our public lands are a great place to start, and the Replant Act will help us do this. My last number, 49,000. And we heard this one from Congressman Panetta earlier. That's the number of jobs that we could support over the course of the next decade with the reforestation that will be funded by the Replant Act. This is a great investment in our country. It's a great investment in our people. And I look forward to exploring this bill in more detail with your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Chris Wood, President and CEO of Drought Unlimited, for his testimony on HR 2816. Mr. Wood? We can see you, but we can't hear you, sir. If you could unmute your line.
Sorry about that, sir. I was on mute.
No problem.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse. I actually had a more dramatic problem. My battery died in my computer, and I had to get my brother to run his over. Thank you, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today in support of HR 2816, which is the Legacy Roads and Trails Act. As was said, my name is Chris Wood, and I'm the President and CEO of Drought Unlimited. On behalf of TU and our 350,000 members and supporters nationwide, I'm very pleased to express our support for this terrific bill. HR 2816, as has been said, is a bipartisan bill led by Representatives Schreier and Simpson. It would reinstate the Legacy Roads and Trails program, which helps with road, bridge, and trail maintenance, and importantly for me and for our members, also helps to reconnect fish habitat for trout and salmon. The Forest Service right now manages what is likely the world's largest road system. And when these roads are not properly maintained, they have a tendency to fall off the hillside, and they can become unsafe for travel and erode into streams. The national forests, as has been stated earlier, are a vital source of drinking water for more than 60 million Americans. Unfortunately, erosion associated with these deteriorating roads and trails can increase water filtration costs for downstream communities and obviously harm fish habitat. More than 60% of the nation's blue ribbon trout streams, that means our finest trout fisheries, flow across our national forests. And it is vital that fish are able to move in response to floods, fire, and drought. Impassable or perched culverts can make that up and downstream migration impossible, effectively isolating or stranding fish. Fixing these challenges can be as straightforward as putting in arched bottomless culverts or replacing culverts with bridges. And from 2014 to 2017, my organization worked with the Forest Service to reconnect over 200 miles of rivers and streams on our national forests. Today, 100-year floods are occurring at less than decadal intervals in many parts of the country. And when a flood meets an undersized or a perched culvert, it not only blows out the culvert, but it always takes the road prism above the culvert and may even damage downstream infrastructure. By replacing undersized culverts with bridges, for example, the Legacy Roads and Trail program helps to make downstream communities far more resilient to the effects of flooding, while also fostering access for the growing outdoor recreation economy. Like many agencies, federal agencies, the Forest Service maintains a multi-billion-dollar backlog on their infrastructure, and the Legacy Roads and Trail program will allow the Forest Service to focus its resources on projects that show the highest return on investment for public access, for water quality, for hunting and fishing, and for healthy fish and wildlife habitat. Legacy Roads and Trails funding allowed the Forest Service to remove undersized culverts on the Okanagan Wenatchee National Forest. This work is benefiting today imperiled spring chinook, steelhead, and bull trout. On the McCoy Creek drainage within the Caribou-Targhee National Forest, Trout Unlimited used Legacy Road and Trail seed funding to facilitate the removal of fish passage barriers that prevented the migration of native Yellowstone cutthroat trout. In North Carolina, TU worked with the Nantahala National Forest and leveraged Legacy Roads and Trails funding to reconnect over 20 miles of habitat which was disconnected for brook trout. Across the nation, the Legacy Roads and Trails program has allowed the Forest Service and its partners to replace over 1,000 culverts to restore fish passage, to maintain and storm-proof thousands of miles of roads, to improve 5,000 miles of trails, and to reclaim thousands of miles of unneeded or obsolete roads. It's a terrific example, maybe one of the best examples, of a public-private partnership that delivers tangible results. So I want to thank the chairman, the ranking member, and members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing. TU looks forward to working with all of you to advance this important bill.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. The chair would I'd like to now briefly introduce our next witness, who is a constituent of mine from Colorado's 2nd Congressional District, Ms. Gretchen Reuning, who is the Forest Program Director for the Fort Collins Conservation District. She earned a BS in Environmental Biology from Principia College and an MS in Horticulture and Plant Ecophysiology from Colorado State University. Previously, she's worked in natural resource management and forestry in Illinois, California, New Zealand, and of course, Colorado. With the Fort Collins Conservation District since April 2017, she has implemented over 2,000 acres of treatment across Larimer County. On behalf of all the landowners that you've worked with in Colorado, I do want to say thank you for your contributions to reducing wildfire risk to our homes and our communities, and also working to improve watershed and forest health. So again, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your work, and you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony on HR 3211.
Thank you very much, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the Fort Collins Conservation District, I'm honored to provide testimony for the proposed Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Program. To briefly provide a little background about my organization, the Conservation District's Healthy Forest Initiative partners with the Natural Resources Conservation Service to engage private landowners in our district for forest restoration activities. We provide services such as project planning, funding procurement, and managing the implementation of ecology-based forest restoration projects. And the goals of the Healthy Forest Initiative align really well with those of the Joint Chiefs program. So these goals are to improve ecosystem function, wildlife habitat, and water quality. Our restoration work and efforts would not be possible without the Joint Chiefs program. In 2019, the NRCS and U.S. Forest Service in Northern Front Range of Colorado were awarded $11.6 million in Joint Chiefs funding over the course of 3 years. And this has been the primary source of implementation dollars for our community and has successfully bolstered many collaborative relationships within our watersheds. Through this partnership project, NRCS and the Forest Service have funded the restoration of nearly 9,000 acres of overgrown forest, contributed to community protection and resilience, and also reduced water and air quality impacts from wildfire. Water quality and quantity are quickly becoming one of the greatest priorities for conservation in the American West, especially in light of population growth and predicted future climate regimes. Proactive vegetation management in our frequent fire watersheds provides significant benefit not only to ecosystems, but also downstream users and infrastructure. This proposed bill would also assist in building social capital. The cross-jurisdictional outreach approach employed for these projects increases partner engagement and private landowner education and buy-in. With devoted funding, we can expect local support to increase commensurately. Local support is critical to the success of forest stewardship efforts. Previous Joint Chiefs efforts have also stimulated the local economy. Healthy forests attract hunting, fishing, and tourism, which are all valuable aspects of economies in the Mountain West. Consistent revenue through forest stewardship contracts have also encouraged local logging contractors to expand their capacities, including equipment, personnel, and wood product markets. So a diverse contractor base and wood product market, as has been mentioned earlier, are critical to the long-term sustainability of these efforts. The 2020 Cameron Peak Fire in northern Colorado really highlighted the benefits of supporting this bill. By working collaboratively and strategically in the years prior to the 2020 fire season, the Forest Service and the Fort Collins Conservation District implemented mechanical harvesting and prescribed burning on over 4,000 acres at the Forest Service's Pingree Hill project and also private land at the Shambhala Mountain Center in Red Feather Lakes. Firefighters described this cross-jurisdictional, ecology-based work as crucial in their efforts to halt the advancing fire front before it reached downwind communities that were higher in population, such as Glacier View Meadows. With wildfire seasons in the West expanding to nearly year-round, our forests have suffered a loss of diversity, wildlife habitat, and also resilience. Forests provide ecosystem services that have far-reaching benefits, positively impacting ecosystem function, community resilience, and economic health. Wildfires are outpacing current adaptive forest management, highlighting the need for a proactive and aggressive stewardship. Investing in the Joint Chiefs program will help offset wildfire suppression and repair costs, while simultaneously building capacity to enhance the pace and scale of proactive forest stewardship. So thank you again, Mr. Chair, and all other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to share my support and enthusiasm for this proposed bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Reunion, again for your testimony and for your work. And we look forward to being able to ask you some questions. The chair will now recognize Ms. Miller Meeks from state of Iowa so that she can recognize, or rather introduce, Captain John Poliska, a retired U.S. Army veteran from Bloomfield, Iowa. We thank you, Mr. Poliska, for your service to our country, and we'll now recognize Ms. Miller Meeks so that she can give you a formal introduction. Ms. Miller Meeks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher. It's an honor to introduce my constituent, Captain John Poliska, to testify on the Veterans in Parks Act. John grew up in southeastern Iowa and went on to serve for 15 years in the Army, including tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan. John is a Purple Heart recipient who medically retired in 2017 after incurring shrapnel injuries and numerous surgeries. His recovery was not without challenges, but John's dedication to and love for our country is both remarkable and profound. And I also want to congratulate him on the recent birth of his son, Finn Matthew. I thank him for coming today to share his story and perspective. So it's with great pleasure to introduce to you Captain John Poliska. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Poliska, excuse me, Captain Poliska, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the congratulatory note, Representative Miller Meeks. So, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, Westerman, and members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to come before you today to provide this testimony, and thank you for allowing me to participate in today's hearing on the Veterans in Parks Act sponsored by Representative Miller Meeks. By way of background, which you just heard a little bit about, I grew up in southeastern Iowa, Iowa's District 02, where I uprooted to attend Fordham University in New York City just days before the 9/11 attacks. And on September 11th, I made my way down to Ground Zero, where I aided in the search and rescue process. This was just my 6th day of my freshman year at college at 18 years old. And I was one of the youngest first responders. So you can imagine this was a transformative experience, and I immediately began the enlistment process into the Army, serving in Iraq, Afghanistan, and also across Asia with my Special Forces unit. So my story is one of many, and in fact, each veteran's story is unique, but what we share is a common love for this country. And neither my family nor I are strangers to the sacrifices it takes to serve this great nation and protect this land. I've been in battle with the finest men and women from the United States of America, and each of these patriots have given the oath, which may require making the unimaginable sacrifice of giving their life for freedom. Thankfully, I've survived each combat trip. My service came at a cost: surgeries, physical therapy, speech therapy, and the biggest challenge, overcoming post-traumatic stress and dealing with the images of war and loss. I have my relative health, a wonderful and supportive family, and my first child, Finn, was just born days ago. I love America, and I love serving next to Americans who love everything about this country just as much as my family and I. So I mentioned the word freedom earlier, and is it a concept? Is it a place? Is it the result of an action? I tell you, members, for me, it is all of those, and I find this each and every time. I'm so very fortunate to visit the outdoors in our national parks. So in between deployments, I would drive to Yellowstone National Park, and I would find my freedom all throughout the park. There's something about connecting to nature that all these parks have that helps with the healing. I'll always carry the wounds of war with me wherever I go. But when I go to these beautiful places, I'm able to connect with one of the reasons I decided to serve, and that is this incredible, beautiful country. So I feel a connection to this country when I visit these national parks. My soldier that was next to me that day in the roadside bomb attack, Staff Sergeant Travis Strong, lost both of his legs on that fateful day. Now Travis finds his strength in challenging himself physically at national parks. He's summited various peaks throughout the U.S. with only his hands. And for him, his park is Yosemite. While I was recovering from my injuries, I was assigned as an assistant casualty officer, where I had the privilege of serving the Purcell family. Ashley Purcell lost her brother Michael and became a Gold Star family member. In her own words, Ashley describes hiking in national parks as a relief of endorphins, but also a relief of weight. Once you summit, you can take the heavy pack off. This could be a physical pack, but also an emotional pack. Even if just for a moment, the weight goes to the clouds. So, Gold Star family members carry the pack of grief every single day. She describes our parks as a way to connect to stories and memories. And for Ashley, her park is Olympic National Park, where she carries the same American flag and Gold Star family flag. I look forward to the days when my son Finn is just a bit bigger and I can share the national parks with him. I imagine him staring out at the glaciers at Glacier National Park, hiking in Zion National Park, and sharing my favorite park with him, Yellowstone National Park, looking at the hot springs and taking him down to Lower Falls, looking at all the different animals. So I urge you to support the Veterans in Park Act for the veterans that have served and for the veterans who have made the ultimate sacrifice. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Captain Poliska, for, again, your courageous service to our country. And as a father of a 2-year-old, I can assure you, you have many fun adventures on your way here with your congratulations on your newborn son. The chair will now hand over the gavel to the distinguished chair of the Subcommittee on Indigenous Peoples in the United States, Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, to introduce our next witness and to proceed with the hearing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to each of our witnesses so far for their moving testimony. The Chair now recognizes Dr. Elaine O'Neill, Director of Science and Sustainability, Consortium for Research on Renewable Industrial Materials, for her testimony on HR 2049.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Very good. Good afternoon, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Members Fulcher and Westerman, and committee members. I've been introduced, but I want to just say briefly what Quorum is, the Consortium for Research on Renewable Industrial Materials. It's a nonprofit with 20 university members from across the U.S. Collectively, we've spent about 25 years studying the environmental performance of wood, and in the process, doing the calculations that demonstrate the unique, measurable benefits of using wood as a climate mitigation technology. My field of expertise is on the impacts of climate change on our forests, life cycle assessments of forest operations, forest management, natural disturbance, and forest carbon. I was invited to speak today about the efficacy of planting trees after climate-driven disturbance as proposed by the Replant Act. Now, Quorum's research finds that a more comprehensive approach that accounts for forests, wood products, wood alternatives, and their impacts is needed to maximize climate benefits from forested systems. The accounting is really complex, so in May 2021, we released a synthesis work called the Plant a Trillion Trees Campaign to Reduce Global Warming, fleshing out the concept. You should be seeing a slide shortly here, which is figure 1 of that paper. It shows the annual harvest, net timber growth, and tree mortality across all national forest timberlands from 1962 to 2016. It uses U.S. Forest Service forest inventory and analysis data that is gathered as a requirement of the 1974 Resource Planning Act. Beginning in 1986, which is that vertical dotted line, timber harvesting declined on national forests by 75%, but there was no corresponding increase in net growth. Why? Fires, insect, and disease increased mortality by more than 200%. Many areas are now becoming sources of greenhouse gas emissions instead of sinks, including some of the states that you represent. How did that happen? The forests were often too dense, too uniform, and too old to sync with the changes we are seeing in our weather and in our climate. Our analysis of FIA data shows that even before the natural disturbance events, these overcrowded forests provided little biodiversity and little resistance to catastrophic fires. What these data also show is that planting more forests will not address the climate problem unless we also think about how we're going to manage them in the face of our current and future climate challenges. Quorum's comprehensive analysis of the entire life cycle of the forest, plus wood products and alternative materials and their uses and impacts, shows how to address current and future climate challenges starting today with today's technologies, and I think that's really important. In the figure shown, we even have considered a visionary alternative that incorporates wood into the circular economy, which really is the next frontier for all material use. Our analysis shows that even from forests managed on relatively short rotations in the Douglas fir region, the climate benefit of removing carbon dioxide from the air via tree growth, combined with current allocations of wood products. We're not talking anything fancy like mass timber and tall wood buildings, just current allocations of wood products and common substitutes for non-wood products far exceed potential benefits of leaving the forest unmanaged and unharvested, which is shown by that red bar overlaid on the figure. It also shows that with management and not just tree planting, we can attain carbon benefits faster and with fewer risks of loss than if we plant it and leave it to nature. Analysis of current FIA data and its inclusion in EPA's greenhouse gas account shows that privately managed forests are still able to offset the high mortality seen on public lands. For how much longer, given forest mortality from recent and current fire seasons, is unknown. So yes, we need to replant public lands after natural disasters. There are thousands of acres of burned over land, some of which have no seed source. That said, the Replant Act is based on an extremely limited small-scale vision that puts a Band-Aid on the problems facing our national forest systems. There are millions more acres in desperate need of remedial treatment that could yield timber products, rural jobs, and materials for the infrastructure rebuild that is currently under discussion, all with a low carbon footprint. Such an integrated approach would result in much greater benefits across multiple systems. Concurrently, treatments would increase the vigor on the remaining trees and mitigate fire risk, thus ensuring the health and future of our national forest system consistent with the multiple use mandate of the Resource Planning Act that you're contemplating amending with the Replant Act of 2021. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we'll now move to questions from our members. I would first call on Representative Tonko if he is available. Representative Tonko. We'll now seek if Representative Fulcher is available to ask questions. Representative Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And a question for Dr. O'Neill. I appreciate the data that you shared, and that synchronizes to a large extent with some of the other sources of information that we have seen. But one of the pieces of legislation that we're dealing with today, Mr. O'Neill, has to do with actually limiting access of forest roads and either just turning them into trails or just eliminating them in their entirety. You were talking about management and just the overall access issue. In your view, how does that limitation of access impact wise management?
I would say that you need roads to fight fire effectively. Our experience here, I'm in Washington State. Our experience here is that you fall back to the place where you can defend, and so you don't defend in areas that you don't have roads. That said, if you're not able to manage those roads to prevent erosion, et cetera, then you're sort of in this double jeopardy. In order to manage the roads, you need to be able to do some management in there, so that there's a double jeopardy going on there.
Thank you, Dr. O'Neill. Madam Chair, are you back? Madam Chair?
Yes.
Are you back?
Oh, thank you very much, Representative. The chair will now recognize Mr. Rosendale if he is on. If not, I will now go to, I see Representative Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte for 5, there's Mr. Rosendale. Hello, Representative Rosendale, for 5 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Audio okay?
Excellent.
Okay. An important, this is going to be for Ms. O'Neill, Dr. O'Neill. An important aspect of wildfire management is forestry recovery, but even more important is wildfire prevention. Replanting forests without the capability of managing them can only result in failure and compounding of the problems we currently face. In addressing the threat of catastrophic wildfires, reforestation should be secondary to active management. The Replant Act aims to plant hundreds of thousands of trees without a plan to manage them, while the federal government is having difficulties managing the forests that stand today. In your expert opinion, do you believe it is prudent to implement vast reforestation efforts before addressing the problems that lead to these catastrophic fires, such as overly dense forests and abundance of fuels?
Having done work on life cycle inventory and assessment in a region we call the Inland Northwest, and we really focus on that region as opposed to some of the regions further south that don't have the infrastructure to handle any kind of treatments and removals from federal lands. What we've found is that depending on the kind of management, you can have an impact on the fire risk. But if you only do sort of very, very light management, depending on what the inventory looks like, depending on what the forest condition looks like, and now I'm going to get way down in the reeds because I was a practicing forester before I became a doctor, is that you need to be thinking about that as a system. And in thinking about that as a system, it's not sufficient to just look at one element, whether it's planting or whether it's harvesting or any of those things, because one of the challenges is going to be, how do you do these kinds of treatments if nobody will bid on it because there isn't any place to send the wood? We have examples that I work with colleagues. There's one in Arizona where they do all of this thinning and treatment, and they send the raw logs to Korea to burn for energy in Korea because there is no resource here in Arizona to manage it. So I think that we need to do management to reduce this fire risk, without a doubt. but we need to think about it as in a much broader sort of systems approach. How does it fit within the infrastructure needs of a particular forest? How does it fit with the surrounding territory? Is there sufficient non-federal wood there to support this? And really, how do you get people to invest in infrastructure, milling facilities, pellet facilities, biochar, any of those things, if you don't have long-term commitment? You don't get that kind of investment. So that's sort of long-winded, and I'm not really sidestepping the issue as much as talking about it needs to be system-wide in order to have an effective solution.
Sure, I appreciate that. Basically, it's the same as when we're looking at a person's physical health. We want to look at them holistically and look at the whole body, everything from their diet to the conditions that they live in. So as we look at this whole system, then, do you believe that the Biden administration's efforts to further lock up land and prevent proper management, all in pursuit of the unclear aim of locking up 30% of our land and water to prevent this from successfully happening, jeopardizing or even killing critical timber production and rural jobs in many rural communities that are hurting right now? Do you see that as being beneficial, adding to this whole holistic plan that we talk about, or actually hindering it?
I would have to defer to look at the actual data on that. But here's what I know from doing some work, again, in these fire-dependent systems. We already know that in terms of available timber versus what's actually harvested, we're harvesting far less than 70%. Like if you're talking about the 30 by 30 initiative, locking up 30% of the forest, we're probably already there. It's just not, it's administrative. We're not actually treating the other 70% anyway. So I don't necessarily have opinion on 30 by 30, but I do look at it and say, this is based on available timberland, which in theory is available for harvest right now. It's not in reserve status. It's available for harvest, but it's not being harvested.
Madam Chair, I see my time is up. I would yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. The chair will now recognize Representative Tonko for 5 minutes.
Hey, Representative Fernandez, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My question is for Mr. Wood, please, and it's regarding climate change and infrastructure, and just how does the Legacy Roads and Trail program ensure that our infrastructure is storm ready?
As I thank you for the question, Congressman. As I said in my testimony, part of the challenge with these culverts, which are basically the pipes that run underneath, roads in America that carry streams, is that when these things are either put in when they're too small, or they get perched, meaning on the downstream side, the water will eventually elevate the pipe. It'll erode the river bottom, so the pipe will be elevated. What happens is they tend to get plugged up by debris, and then the debris will eventually, if the force of the flood is strong enough, it will blow that culvert out. It'll literally blow the culvert out of the road. It'll cut carve a hole through the road, and then it can carry that material downstream, and you could lose other infrastructure like bridges and private property. And so by replacing these culverts, by using the Legacy Roads and Trails funding, you can actually get ahead of the problem. You can protect downstream communities from the effect of these devastating floods by letting rivers function a little more naturally. A healthy river should catch, store, and then slowly release water over time. And the more that we're able to reconnect these river systems to their floodplains by doing things like replacing culverts with bridges, the more likely we are to protect downstream communities.
Thank you. That being said, are there other benefits as well, such as those that might relate to recreation or broader ecosystem health?
There's tremendous benefits from a fisheries perspective, which is one that I'm fairly myopically focused on. So trout and salmon, they need to move in response to floods, fire, and drought, Right now, the national forest in particular are absolutely vital as refuges for native trout all across the West, in particular, also in the East for brook trout. But what happens is if you get a prolonged drought or an intense fire, those fish need to be able to swim downstream to get away from the heat or the, it could be the fire itself. And if those culverts don't pass fish, then they can't get downstream. They need to be able to move in response to droughts down to larger water bodies down below if the higher elevation areas are drying up. So, to the extent that climate change is defined by unnaturally intense fires, prolonged drought, and unnaturally intense and frequent flooding, this program will help to allow fish and wildlife to move through a connected system.
Well, I think that's welcome good news, and it does bear several benefits from many perspectives. With that, Representative Fernandez, I will yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you, Representative Tonko. The chair would now like to recognize Representative Blake Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I have a little bit of an HVAC issue. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. You're the only one who's stuck in the HVAC.
Our district offices are great and all, but sometimes. My first question, thank you all for being here. My first question will be to Captain Poliska. Thank you again for your service. My district is blessed to have the presence of thousands of fighters who sacrifice to support our great nation. It's one of the reasons why I was proud to co-sponsor the Veterans in Parks Act. In your testimony, you touched on how much you value our great outdoor spaces. Can you touch on or elaborate on what it is about visiting our parks that makes them so restorative, if you will?
Sure. Thank you, Representative, for that question. And I can speak to a similar situation. I'm here in an attic that's 1 foot shorter than I am tall. On that, I think, just mentioning, having the outdoor, spaces, certainly there's an emotional, spiritual benefits. These are significant because they are sanctuaries, to us. Many of us, took an oath, whether we sacrificed with blood, our life, or just giving the oath. This land is for us to, as all Americans, to refit, to relax, to have somewhere safe. For me, it's inspiring. It's creative. It is a place for bonding. Maybe specifically to the bill, removing some of the financial barriers. Not all families come from the same supportive background or social economic status, and so you'd be shocked. Serving in the military, what small amounts of fees, or just logistical, administrative barriers will prevent some soldiers or veterans from trying to participate in something that's there for us. The parks are teach us about the environment. Many of the committees, the talks that we've heard about today, the wildlife history, various social and cultural barriers. I think I've thrown enough at you to let you know how much from my seat and for many of those veterans and military wars that I've served next to, appreciate the federal lands. If that answers your question.
Yeah, excellent. Utah is a place with an enormous amount, a high percentage of public lands, and a strong veterans community. So I was thrilled to be a part of this. Representative Miller Meeks is a close friend, and I think she's got a really good, strong sense of productivity involved with actually doing something. I think in her testimony, the part that was really great was it's a lot of lip service, and I'm sure you've been the recipient of much lip service talking about your experience and your service, but it's something that we can kind of show it. So I hopefully this can move through. Dr. O'Neill, you made some. Thank you for your comments on the importance of reforestation. My question to you is, can you speak to, maybe elaborate on the value of using new technologies? May not even be that new, but at least embracing technology to better manage our forest and plant trees. I introduced the Forest Tech Improvement Act, which leverages drones, LiDAR, the study to be able to determine how those types of technologies can improve in this reforestation. Would love your how to embrace that.
Well, that's sort of out of left field. Love the idea of using drone technology, but frankly, there's going to be some real challenges with any kind of reforestation effort, just because the conditions that the trees are going into is so extreme that you have no cover, and your mortality is going to be extremely high. It's even high in less benign environments. And so thinking about, I just looked at some of the numbers, 4 million acres, and somebody mentioned 1.2 billion trees, which is as many trees as we plant now in the whole US. We plant 1.2 billion trees. So you're looking at doubling our nursery stock and or finding some sort of alternative, like maybe using drone technology in seeding. But again, you're dealing with just a massive, massive challenge there. And if you're planting, for example, even at $1 a tree, by the time you buy the tree and plant the tree, you're looking at $1.2 billion. So I would say that we're going to have to think about this fairly using sophisticated approaches like perhaps drone technology in seeding, and anticipate quite a bit of loss in there. But again, I'm way down in the weeds doing the forester thing on that. I would love to take that offline.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I'm up on time, so I appreciate it, and we'll yield back.
Thank you very much. And the chair would now like to recognize Representative Jay Obernolte, who I believe might be close to a forest right now.
Sitting in the middle of one, in fact. Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Captain Poliska. I am very proud to be a co-author of the Veterans and Parks Act. I represent a district where over 90% of the landmass is public lands of one point or another, including several national parks. I also represent a district with lots and lots of veterans and lots of military installations. So this is something that I'm very passionate about. So I would say that this is a good start. But I wonder if you could tell us if there are other barriers to getting our veterans involved in the outdoors and outdoor recreation other than just the financial barrier of admission, which we're hopefully going to eliminate through this bill.
Yes, thank you, Representative, for that question. And I look forward to maybe someday visiting your district with all the land resources out there. From my experience, personally, and specifically to a lot of the soldiers that I've served with or led that have had troubles, is the lack of access by communication, of knowing what is out there and how to utilize it. Personally, I've had a phenomenal experience with the Veterans Affairs. I've noticed that a lot of the different various things that I've used to support my health, I found on bulletin boards or in various emails that were a consolidated list. I know there's a number of nonprofits out there who post a variety of different things by region that's going on, whether it be a fishing trips or hikes to the outdoors. Maybe one dimension is that I came from a small team, 12-man team in the Green Berets. So the Green Beret Foundation is one that supported our troops when we were out on the ground overseas, and again when we were either discharged or the Gold Star families, and we were no longer kind of in that active duty capacity, and it can be lonely because the small teams, the cohesion is what you miss, and you lose sight and touch from people. And so I think I'm familiar with their website in particular, and their emails, and they work with a number of variety of nonprofits, the American Legion, and you can name a ton. And I think it's important, the outreach. A lot of the veterans that I've supported because I've sat down with them and I've told them about my own experience and how I've benefited through a variety of different means. And so I think it really takes an effort to communicate, maybe from federal side, but partnering with the the state and local communities that kind of gather all the different information and opportunities from the nonprofits alike.
Great.
Thank you.
So thank you. That was valuable. So follow-on question then, how can we in federal government and specifically the VA do a better job at communicating these opportunities to active duty veterans and also after they leave service?
Sure. Well, I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. military, Department of Defense, or Veteran Affairs at the moment, but from my medical retirement experience and from those that have departed service, there's a number of different processes that are mandatory to go through when you depart, whether retirement or non-retirement. Having these mandatory items can be helpful, but I think it's impactful maybe 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line. Who's checking in on the guy that needs to be checked in on? And I think that's where maybe sometimes we're missing it. And I take that personally to look after those guys that I saw struggle, I saw injured, in that capacity. So I think that would be a way that I would support any additional outreach externally after their service.
Okay, well, thanks. That's something we'll have to work on. Well, thanks for your service to our country and for your testimony today. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Captain Poliska, thank you very much for your service. I found your testimony quite moving and resonant with your description of our parks as part of our sacred inheritance that you and our brave veterans fought to protect. So thank you very much for that positioning of what it is, because these parks are truly who we are as Americans. They are an inheritance. I know that Chair Neguse wanted to focus on some of the work in Colorado. And so even though I do not see that CD3 is not better than his district, I would like to ask Ms. Mooning a question. Wildfire has obviously been a driver of forest health initiatives. In your testimony, you touched a bit on the 2012 High Park fire as well as the more recent Cameron Peak fire. So while wildfire risk reduction is clearly a benefit of healthy forest initiatives, can you speak a little bit more to how projects are chosen and what other ecosystem health metrics are you trying to achieve with these ambitious landscape scale projects?
Thank you for the question. So we work with a good number of partners in our community, which is really the only one I can speak to here, but we work with state, local, nonprofits, as well as our Forest Service partners to identify projects that will have the largest impact for communities, for water infrastructure, and also just for wildlife benefit. So what we always say for our projects that we take on as a conservation district is we're striving to achieve a multi-resource benefit. So we're not just looking to reduce wildfire risk, we're also looking to improve whole forest ecosystem health. So that's looking at water quality, air quality impacts, also wildlife habitat, and then all of the habitat elements that come along with that influence things like pollinators and other values within our district.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Wood, before I ask you my question, I must disclose to the committee that my son, Abelino Fernandez Ledger, took on an internship with Trout Unlimited and River Source, looking at beavers and how beavers rehabilitate our water sources. And all of the work he has done has transformed him. He is changing his minor. You all do some great work, so full disclosure.
That's great.
But I wanted to talk a bit about, nationally, outdoor recreationists make 160 million visits to national forest and grasslands. 220,000 full and part-time jobs, $15 billion to our nation's GDP. So, we have multiple use for our forests. They also contribute to our gross domestic product. But we also here in New Mexico, especially our rural communities are tight and so close to the forest. So you know, Trout Unlimited really has a great reputation here with Toner Mitchell in New Mexico about tying in and making sure they connect with everybody. So it's the private landowners, it's the local fishermen, it's the local communities. Can you describe how the Legacy Roads and Trails program, making funding available, might assist with this, like, you know, everybody involved collaboration?
Yeah, I'll give you a great example. First of all, congratulations on your son. I'm so glad that he's off to a good start in life with Trout Unlimited. But in Cuesta, New Mexico, which is a town that Toner has worked, extensively with, it's a formerly resource-dependent town. They had a big mine that shut down, caused a lot of problems for the river that flows through town, and we were able to work with people in the town of Cuesta, local TU chapters, state agencies, federal agencies, and they're turning the river that flows through the town into a destination fishery. So it's still a resource dependent community today. It's just that it's a different resource. It's recreation. It's people coming who want to stay there, stay in the community, pay for guides, buy gas, buy meals, etc. And the key, every community wants to take better care of the lands and waters that define it. The limitation typically is funding. And there's a lot of ways that you can find restoration funding, but funding culvert work and fixing up degraded roads isn't particularly sexy. So having a dedicated pot of funding like this that can then serve as an accelerant, where we can then leverage it with more private funding, funding from organizations like Trout Unlimited, more state funding. All of a sudden you can take a relatively small amount of money and turn it into a really big amount of money and transform a community by doing a whole watershed restoration that drives a restoration economy in a way that it never could before.
Thank you very much. I was out hiking one of the wildernesses next to Cuesta a few days ago, and it is beautiful. Thank you for your work there. I want to thank all of our witnesses for participating today. You gave just such a great summary of what we are looking at, what we are facing, both the threats on our forests, but what we can do. We are not powerless. What we can do to involve our communities and to address and manage our forests. I do not believe there are any members not yet recognized. If there are, please speak up for recognition. So for the witnesses, once again, your testimony was incredibly valuable. The members of the committee may have additional questions. We will ask you to respond to those in writing. We will ask our committee members to send them out in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for those responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you to each of you.